All right, guys. So this video I'm making here is going to take the place of class on Friday for the gross muscle anatomy, and so this is kind of marks our transition from the moving out of bones and joints and now into muscle. And so this one will be largely just about kind of some of the microanatomy of muscle, the hierarchy of the muscle structure, and then just some general terminology about muscle. And then later on, we'll start on Monday with your TBL day. We'll move into actual naming of muscles, muscle actions, and things like that. So let's get going. All right. So um, first of all, we're starting with this idea of the hierarchy of muscle structure. Okay. And so one thing to know about muscle cells is they're also known as fibers. Okay. There's one other cell like this in the body that we call fibers, and that's neurons. So nerve cells or neurons are also called fibers. Okay, and these typically are just long, tough cells. Okay, so that's we can use that synonymously. You can call them muscle cells or muscle fibers. Okay, and then as far as the hierarchy goes, pretty much we're going to start with what we think of as a muscle. We'll start with something like the biceps brachii, right? That's your biceps muscle in your upper arm. And that would be called kind of like the gross muscle, the large muscle that you can see. And so when we're going to work our way down to the hierarchy from there, each one has a different named membrane that covers each level of the hierarchy. So let's start with the whole muscle itself, or the gross muscle. That is covered by a membrane called epimysium, okay, or epimysium. Okay, epimysium covers the whole muscle. Okay, a muscle itself, the whole muscle, is made up of many fascicles. Okay, these little structures called fascicles. Each fascicle is then covered by a different membrane called the paramecium. Okay, each of those fascicles then is made up of many actual muscle fibers or muscle cells. Okay, and each of those are covered by the endomysium or endomysium. Okay, so we got the three membranes there. One, epimysium covers the whole muscle. Two, paramecium covers each fascicle. And then three, endomysium covers each muscle cell or muscle fiber. Okay, so underneath the endomysium is what we know of as the sarcolemma, which is really just a special cell membrane that is found in muscle cells. Okay, so then from there, each muscle fiber, so each muscle cell itself is made up of many of these little structures called myofibrils. Okay, and there's no more membranes at this part, but then each myofibril is made up of many sarcomeres. Okay, and the sarcomere is really the functional unit of muscle. Okay, so sarcomeres. And then finally, the sarcomeres are made up of the proteins that actually make up the muscle, which the two primary ones are called actin and myosin. And these protein fibers are known as filaments. So they can be called the myofilaments, okay, or just protein filaments. Okay, so that's a good hierarchy to remember. Remember the names as well as the membranes. We'll keep talking about that a little bit here. Okay, so this hierarchy, and we can kind of fill this in as we go here. Since we're not doing this in class, you won't have the actual clicker question to do. But so the first one here, number one, we're talking about the levels, right? So number one is the muscle, right? That would be the whole muscle that attaches to the bone via an attachment site. We'll talk about those different attachment sites here in a sec. Secondly, we have a muscle that is made up of a bunch of fascicles, okay? And those fascicles then are made up of a bunch of fibers or muscle cells, same thing we just talked about, right? So the membranes that cover each, right? A, we have the epimysium. B, we have the paramecium. And C, we have the endomysium. All right, so then the question on the clicker there, send in the individual, there's the number of the individual muscle cell or the fiber, right? And we can use the next slide, but obviously number 3 would be the fiber. Okay. Next slide is going to take us further in the hierarchy than we've seen so far. This last slide is what we'd already seen, but now we're going to go deeper and see what makes up the muscle cell itself, right? So as it said on the first slide, first of all, 3, again, is that same thing it was over here, which is the cell, okay? So this is the level of the cell. There's a nucleus, but then the cell is made up of all these little guys, number 4, right? And what were those? Those were called myofibrils, okay? So then we zoom in on one of those myofibrils right there, and we see what's going on. So there's one myofibril, okay? But then we take that myofibril, zoom in even closer, and what do we find there? We find sarcomeres, okay? And sarcomeres are then, if we zoom in even further to just one section of sarcomere, we'd be zooming in like right here, okay? Or maybe right here. Then that last level is the myofilaments, and the thick filament is known as myosin, and the thin filament is known as actin. Okay? All right, so that gives you a good look at this. We're going to spend a lot more time on myosin and actin and some other proteins and how they work to create muscle contraction when we talk about the sliding filament theory, but for now, we'll just leave it as this has it. Okay, so again, just a little recap on those connective tissue membranes. The epimysium covers the muscle. Okay, we also know this as fascia. Okay, connects to tendons and bones. Perimysium covers the fascicles. Okay, that houses blood vessels and nerves. Okay, and the endomysium covers the muscle fiber itself. All are different forms of loose connective tissue. Okay, mostly reticular fibers. So that areolar connective tissue. All layers are interconnected, and you started to see this in the cats, right, when everything's so interconnected. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about muscle attachments. Okay, so how do muscles attach to bone? Okay, and there's 2 different versions of attachments. Okay, so the overall thing is attachments, but then underneath attachments, there's 2 options. It can either be the origin, okay, or it can be the insertion. Okay, so they're both connections to the skeletal system, right? You see that is underneath both of them, but the origin is typically the less movable side. Okay, so less movable, all right, and then the insertion is the more movable side. And the origin is typically proximal, or closer to the axial skeleton, whereas the insertion is typically distal. Okay, so if we look at the rectus femoris muscle, it originates here on what's known as the the anterior superior iliac spine, right? But this one is actually the inferior. So let me cross that out. Instead of the ASIS, which is the one you learned in class, it's the one right below that. So it's still anterior, but instead of superior, it's the inferior one because it's lower. Okay, so we're going to go anterior inferior iliac spine. Okay, so that's the AIIS, anterior inferior iliac spine. Okay, that would be the origin. Okay, because it's the less movable side. It's on the pelvis. It's more proximal. Okay, then we look at where the rectus femoris attaches. It goes through the patella, right, and then goes down to the tibia on that attachment point where all the quads attach. Okay, and that is going to be the more movable side for sure. Okay. And it's going to be the more distal side. Okay, so we have the origin up in the pelvis and the insertion down on the tibia. Okay, and so we have the biceps brachii here, seeing insertion there, origin up here in the shoulder. Okay, so there's just a couple examples. Okay, so different types of ways that muscles can attach to bone. Okay. And so a couple options here. We have what's called a direct attachment versus an indirect attachment. Okay, direct attachment is less common. And what we see here is we see the epimysium attaching directly to bone or cartilage. Okay, so that means there's no tendon or aponeurosis. Okay, so examples of these would be gluteus medius, gluteus minimus. See right in here in the origin site, there's no tendon there. There's no white tissue, right? It just goes muscle right to bone. Okay, So that's less common, but we do have those sometimes. Okay, we have it right here on these bones in the head as well. Okay, the other thing to talk about here is a difference between a tendon and the aponeurosis. Okay, a tendon is typically like this. It's going to be kind of this thick rope-like structure, but then an aponeurosis is broad and flat. Okay, so like this one here, that's an aponeurosis. Okay, so indirect attachments are much more common. That's where we have the epimysium connecting to connective tissue, and that's a tendon, or aponeurosis. Okay, and then that connects to the bone from there. Okay, these are much more common, stronger, can stretch, helps us to cross over tricky spots over joints and things like that. So those are the two options for attachments, but indirect are much more common. Okay, secondly, or another idea here, another structure that you need to be aware of is called a retinacula. A retinacula acts to hold down tendons. Okay, many of our tendons are in locations where, when we moved our joint, the shorter distance between the 2 points where the origin and insertion of the tendon is it would make a straight line. So, for example, when you in your wrist, when you extend your fingers back and bring your wrist backwards, and that's wrist extension, you have a bunch of muscles that are coming up from your elbow, going down into your fingers and into your wrist. If there wasn't something to hold those tendons down in your wrist, then those tendons would just pop up and lift your skin up and make a shorter line between your hand and your elbow, right? But instead you have this retinacula right here, excuse me, that holds those tendons down. So instead of the tendons lifting way up and going across here, they're held down. So it's kind of like this pulley system that the tendons go through. Okay, we have another one. We have lots of them at our ankle as well. Okay, so all these in the ankle, these are all helping us to hold tendons down. So they're very similar to ligaments, very strong, but their main job is to hold down tendons. Okay, so I have a really cool video that I'm not going to show you here because there's some copyright issues with me showing you somebody else's YouTube video on my YouTube video. Okay, so I'm not going to show you that, but if you remind me and if I remember in class, I'll show you that video. And what happens is you can get an injury to your retinaculum in your ankle is a common one, and the tendons actually pop out of place and kind of slip, and that can be pretty painful and dangerous. So remind me to show you that one in class, and I will. Okay, so a few more definitions and terms that we need to be familiar with as far as muscles go. There's these different functional groups of muscle. Okay, so the first one is called groups that are called synergists. Okay, these muscles work together to produce the same movement. So ones you can think of would be the 4 quadriceps muscles, right? It's 4 separate muscles. They all do the same thing. They all extend the knee. Okay, so all 4 of those work together synergistically to provide the same motion. Okay. Second one are called antagonists. This is the exact opposite of synergists. These produce opposite motions. Okay, they're also helpful for decelerating joints, and we'll talk more about that later. So the example here would be the biceps versus the triceps, right? Your biceps flex your elbow, triceps extend your elbow. They do the exact opposite action. So those are called antagonists. Secondly, hamstrings versus quads, right? Hamstrings are knee flexors. They bring your heel up towards your butt, right? Whereas the quadriceps do the opposite. They extend your knee. Okay, so those are 2 terms to remember. Third, we have what's called the prime movers in an action. Okay, so this is the most important player in a group of synergists. Okay, so we have a bunch of different muscles that extend the hip. All of your hamstrings do this. Okay, as well as some others, but the strongest hip extensor, or other glutes as well, but the strongest hip extensor is gluteus maximus. So that makes it the prime mover of hip extension. Okay, and then there's fixator muscles. We typically think of muscles actually moving joints and producing joint movement, but it's also very important many times for muscles to contract and then no movement's produced at all, but it just stabilizes a joint, right? And so I can show you this one in class when we talk about the hip, but the gluteus medius muscle is known as an abductor or abductor of the hip, which means that if you stand on your left leg and just lift your right leg out to the side and abduct it, That's abduction, okay? But that's what it does as a mover. But as a fixator, that exact other leg that you were standing on, that left leg, it had to contract. The gluteus medius had to contract to hold your pelvis in place. Because if it didn't, then your pelvis on that side would just fall down, okay? So if you relax your gluteus medius when you're standing on one foot, then the other side drops, okay? So those fixator muscles are very important. Okay, a couple other concepts related to muscles. One of these is called fascicle arrangement. Okay, remember those fascicles? That was what was what from muscle to fascicles, right? So this big bundle of muscle fibers is really what a fascicle is, and we have different ways that these fascicles are arranged in different muscles. Okay, so the first one we'll talk about is a circular arrangement of fascicles. Okay, so we have. These are typically places where we have sphincters or facial muscles. Okay, so if we think about the muscles around our eye, muscles around our anus, muscles that hold back in our urine, in our urethra, those things are circles. And when we contract them, they close, right? Relax, they open. Okay, so all those little fascicles are just going around in a circle. Right? They're going around in a circle like this. So when they squeeze down tighter. Okay? Secondly, is what's known as the convergent fascicle arrangement. And think of a fan shape for this. Okay? So it has a very broad origin, and then the fascicles converge towards a single tendon. So this is a great example of this, and that one looks like the pectoralis major. So think of that big muscle in your chest. On the medial side, close to your sternum, over here, it's this big broad origin, right? It connects to a bunch of different ribs in your chest, and then all of those come together on your humerus. Okay, so what that does is that gives you a lot of force production there, because we create a lot of force on the origin side, and then all that force is transmitted to one spot here on the insertion site. Okay, and that's just the way the fascicles are arranged. Also, the latissimus dorsi, or the lats, is that way. Okay, we also have what's called the pinnate arrangement. Pinnate arrangement means that there's a long central tendon, okay, and then all the fibers feather off of that one central tendon. Okay, the purpose of this is it gives you lots of strength due to multiple angles of pull on the same tendon. Okay, we can't shorten it too much, so we have a low range of motion, or ROM. Okay, but we have a decent amount of strength because of the multiple angles of pull on one tendon. But then underneath the pinnate arrangements, we have three different types. We have the unipinnate, we have the bipinnate, and the multipinnate. Okay, so if you had to guess here which one was which, right, we can see unipinnate in B right here. We have a central tendon, we have all the fibers going off of one direction off of that central tendon. Okay, so that's unipinnate. One example of that is a muscle in your wrist called your extensor digitorum longus. Okay, then we have bipinnate. Still, we got the central tendon here, rectus femoris, but then we got we have fibers going off in one direction and then a second direction. Okay, so you can think about both those fibers pulling this way, right? They're all pulling that way, and that creates a lot of pull and a lot of force down here to be created. And then lastly is multipinnate, and the deltoid muscles in your shoulder are this way. So we have a central tendon, but then we have multiple central tendons in each of these, and so we have muscle fibers pulling multiple directions on all these little smaller tendons, which eventually connect back, and so this gives us lots of force. Okay, so this one, the unipinnate, is definitely the least force. Yeah, so that's the pinnate arrangement in three different types. Okay, a couple more. We have what's called the parallel arrangement. Usually very long muscles. They can shorten a long ways. They're not as strong, so lower force than some of the other arrangements, because really there's just less fibers in contact with the tendon. Some of the fibers run the whole length of the muscle. Okay, one example of this is the longest muscle in your body, called your sartorius. It goes from your pelvis down to your knee, down to your tendon, to your tibia, and it wraps around on the medial side of your tibia. And that muscle in tall people can be 2 to 3 feet long, right? 2 to 3 feet long. Okay, so what that means, I even looked this up when I heard this initially in the book. I thought that can't be true. There can't be actual cells that are muscle cells that are 2 to 3 feet long. But I looked up and found some peer-reviewed research on this and found out that yes, actually, around 20 to 30% of the fibers actually run the whole distance. So that means you've got muscle cells that are shortening all the way from this end to this end. All right, so you don't get a lot of force out of that, but you get a lot of range of motion. Okay, large ROM. Okay, and then next one here is called fusiform. Fusiform is very similar to parallel, but instead of just being straight all the way through, it kind of has a bulge in the middle. It's a large spot in the central part of the muscle, and this is what your biceps brachii is. Okay, you get more force out of this because that bulge in the middle just gives more muscle fibers to pull. Okay, but it's similar where you have lots of range of motion and still not as much force as some of the other arrangements like convergent. Okay, and that's it, guys. We will see you on Monday for the TBL day.